Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. All right, excellent. So, we have had an interesting and fun week. I don't know if you guys all saw it, but we put out a video. Um, Apparently, that video says that I'm a better singer than I am a preacher, because it's gone the more people than anything I've ever spoken on a Sunday morning. But that was a lot of fun. I was kind of hoping Josh might start off with that this morning, but I guess you can't have everything you wish for. Either way, it was perfect for what we're going through. But if I wanted to, I could take a pessimistic look and say, well, why do people care about that more than my sermons that we post online? And then you probably get some people giving you a little feedback. So I'm going to say pessimism is this interesting thing in our world that can actually be a little fun. If you ever need a compliment, just be pessimistic. You say, I just don't think I'm as, good as those other folks. And, what's someone going to do? They're going to meet, no, you're great. You're awesome. No, yeah. So if you're ever fishing for anything like that, if you just need that little bit of compliment in your life, be pessimistic. And people will just kind of surround you with trying to make you feel better about yourself. Isn't it true? It's also an easy way to make friends. You can sit there and say, you know what, California politics are crazy. It's nuts. It's going in the gutter. It's in the ditch. And what are you going to have? You're absolutely right. And you're going to have people who sit there and just kind of rally around you and say, man, that's so wise. Pessimism is so easy, and it makes you sound smart. If I were to sit there and say, I bet it's gonna rain today, and if it doesn't rain, no one's gonna remember that I said anything. But if it did rain, they're gonna, you know who predicted that? That Kaylani guy. I'm sure you were there. When I was growing up, I don't know if it was Nostradamus or there was a few end of the world people. Kind of like it was gonna be and. I think one was like 1988, and I can't remember. 2012 obviously was a big one. And all those people thought that these people were geniuses until that year went by and nothing happened. No one faults you when you're wrong, when you're a pessimist. And there's literally no risk to being a pessimist. But if I were to sit there and say, you know what, guys? I think it's going to be a sunny morning. I think we're going to have a great time together, and then it does rain. Who's in the doghouse? Me. So if I sit there and say, I think it's going to rain, and I don't think we should do it, I'm going to be the hero. Pessimism is this thing that is so easy in our world. But the problem is that when you really think about it, do you really want the pessimists to be the ones that are right in our world? Is that who you want, being the ones that we look up to? I want to frame this kind of redefine pessimism in a way that I think helps you understand where I'm going today and helps you understand the dangers of pessimism. I'm going to say that pessimism is a battle against joy. So when I frame it that way, I think you understand it. Literally think about it. Whenever someone is pessimistic, what are they trying to say? Is don't get your hopes up. This is not something you should celebrate. This isn't good. You can kind of go through the list. Pessimism and joy seem to be completely opposite of one another. And so when pessimism wins, joy loses. Okay? And so but yet I want to acknowledge pessimism is so easy that you see it everywhere. It's all around us. I mean, all you have to do is pick up a paper, turn on the TV, anything like that, and you see pessimism because it's easy. But I don't think we often realize that it is causing joy to lose. And then we might actually be more aware of it. I'm going to give you the standard argument that pessimists give. Point one, we're all going to die. That is like number one point. Point two, you need to do something about that. Point three is, no matter what you do, it will not be enough. Point four, we're all going to die. That is kind of the standard. You hear it, it's like, what is the issue you're talking about? Oh, we're all going to die. This is the worst thing ever. So do something about it. But whatever you do, it's not going to be enough. And we're just all going to die. That is kind of how pessimists work. And I'm not picking on any one in particular thing, but just think about in the terms of environmentalism right now. The idea is that we're all going to die because we're destroying our world. So you need to do something about it. Cut down your electricity, but whatever you do, it's not going to be enough. And we're all going to die. Now the crazy part is they're kind of right in the sense that we're all going to die someday. So they can't be wrong. But the question is that the reason to sit there and steal the joy of what you have right now? Now, like I said, I picked on environmentalists because you might all go, yeah, absolutely. But you know what? Christians do it too. I see Christians look at our society all the time and they say, oh, it's going, Jesus come, this is the moment. It's all so bad. We're all going to die unless we do something about it. But whatever you do, it's not going to be enough. And we're all going to die. Everybody does this, not just pessimists, not just people you disagree with. I think when I first became a Christian, someone gave me a book, The Late Great Planet Earth. How many of you guys ever remember this book? Okay, it was a bunch of predictions on how the world was going to end very, very soon. 70s, was it? Yeah. So that was in the 70s. Now, granted, in the grand scheme of things, 70s is probably not that long ago, but, in global time. But I don't think anything that book talked about is still in existence today or is relevant today. But every generation seems to have their late great planet Earth. This book that's basically saying, here are all the signs why you should despair and give up because it's over. And yet, the world continues on. Some might argue, though, if it's just that, you say, but Mike, don't you see what's going on around us? Don't you see all the stuff that's happening? I feel like it's justified now. Just because that guy was wrong in the 70s does not mean that I'm wrong now. And here's the question. Don't our circumstances sometimes demand that we be pessimistic towards life? Hold on to your answer. You don't have to tell me what you think. But that's the question I want you to wrestle with right now. Do your circumstances ever give you a reason to sit there and say, now I am justified in saying, this is not a time for joy. This is the time to be pessimistic. Going back to the first week of this whole series, when we talked about what this fight for joy was, I remember saying joy is a command. God commands us to give joy. And so there is that challenge of how do we wrestle, how do we find joy when we are in situations in which seem to demand pessimism. This is the challenge that I think we face, and sometimes if we don't know how to fight this battle, we end up either not thinking that this is just one of those exceptions, and we don't know how to fight for joy. And the reason I bring this up is because the passage we're going to look at today in the book of Philippians, I want us to look at the circumstances that surround Paul while he is writing this letter. It's interesting. In verse 12, he says, I want you to know, brothers, what has happened to me. Now, if you were to actually look at Paul's circumstances, I'm just going to give you a quick run through. kind of a quick overview. If you can start in Acts and kind of just go from Acts 21 all the way to the end, and you begin to see everything that happened to Paul through this time. But he was preaching the gospel. The people didn't like it, especially because he was welcoming non-Jews into this family, and so there was a riot. And they wanted to kill Paul, and the only way Paul survived was that he basically said, throw me in jail. I'm a Roman citizen. Throw me in jail before they tear me apart. And so he imprisons himself, and now for the next 2 years, he's in jail while they're trying to figure out what to charge him with. And that, I think about just the whole idea of the right to a speedy trial that's in our Constitution. This is kind of where that comes from. It's the idea that there were times where they could sit there and say, until we know what you're guilty of, we're just going to leave you in jail. And so Paul is left in jail for 2 years without a charge. And every time they think about kind of releasing him, someone else, the threat kind of comes back up, and they keep him in jail. And they move him around to different people to say, what do you think about him? What do you think about him? Interestingly enough, the very last one, there's this kind of shot in Acts 26:32 where Felix and Herod Agrippa, who were the two rulers of the time, who were kind of pulling and trying to figure out what to do with this character, said, hey, you know what, we will have let you go, but since you appealed to Caesar, we're going to have to send you to Rome. Now, that's just a jab, okay? They weren't going to ever let him go. But they said that in order to kind of wash their own hands of it, to say, now, of course, if they would let him go, he would have been torn apart. So he gets shipped off to Rome. And if you know the story, on the ship gets wrecked, gets caught up in a storm. Everyone's going to die. Paul says, trust me on this. What we need to do is stay together, la, la, la. There's a whole thing. He saves everyone on the boat. Not a single person dies. And then they still don't let him go. I would think if I were like the guy who had said, you know what, we lost Paul at sea. I was like, just sneak away. Thank you for saving our lives. I'm not going to now continue to take you to Rome. But they do. They still take him to Rome. And he is imprisoned in this, like I described this a couple weeks ago, in this basically this kind of like this little cave, separated from his friends. And the only way he can communicate is by letter and through communication with his friends. So he's disconnected from others. And all he gets now is secondhand information about how things are doing. The churches that he started and planted, he just has to hear how they're doing. Once again, you find out that he spends years here as well as they're trying to figure out what to do. Long enough, as you can see in this passage, apparently every guard knows Paul. Every guard has met him. They know him. He's been there long enough that everyone's had time to kind of interact with him. I don't know if it was because he was a celebrity, kind of like, oh, cool, hey, I want to go meet Paul and see what this guy's about, or if they were just curious or confused by why he was in jail when they didn't really know what he was there for. And while he's in jail, there are people in Rome, Christians in Rome, who are using it as a time to take advantage of his fame. They're trying to steal his thunder. They're trying to take his like mantle, fill his shoes in a way. And so they're like, I'm going to do whatever I can to keep him in jail. These are Christians who are basically glad that Paul is in prison. So, if he had lose his dog and if his truck broke down, this would be a country song. Everything wrong is happening. Everything that could go wrong is going wrong. So I'm just going to pause. Should Paul be pessimistic? You would think that if anyone had reason to be pessimistic, Paul would, given all this that's happened. The reason I bring this up is because as we talk about, I think you know the answer to that question. I think you know that if you read Philippians, Paul is not pessimistic. And the reason we talk about this is because this book gives us keys to know how to fight for joy in our own lives. Last week we talked about how joy comes. One of the ways that Paul found joy is in others, people who were partnered with him, who are part of a community that was focused on the mission of God, and seeing that you are a part of something bigger than any one person, and seeing that God was still at work through other people, that gave Paul joy. He knew that what he cared about most would never die with him, because the church was going to continue on and on and on. This week I want to look at a different reason for the joy that we see in Paul's life. And so let me read for you Philippians chapter 1, 12 to 18. And let's look at what he sees. It says, I want you to know, brothers, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest of my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. In that I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. Now, the immediate thought that someone might have is that Paul's just delusional. All this bad stuff is happening and he's still happy. I mean, I'm sure you've met someone like that in life who just you can't ever seem to get them down. They're just always on positive. Now, there's an old movie called What About Bob? That was kind of like that. I know that was, I think about situations where, there's this Dumb and Dumber, another one. You guys ever remember that one? We jest at people like that, who no matter what you do, they just seem to always be, oh, that's great, Yeah, so you have to sit there and you have to, is Paul like that? Is he just somebody who just cannot, he's so dense that he can't realize that bad things are actually happening to him? Is he a masochist? Does he enjoy pain? Is he this kind of like one of those people who enjoys the suffering? Or is he just blind to what's going around him? Because if Paul doesn't have legitimate reasons for joy, and he's just kind of like, I just enjoy being made fun of or taunted or put in prison. That is not necessarily something I would ever encourage you to be. But I want you to see in this is that he actually does have solid reasons for joy in the midst of some pretty awful circumstances. What he does is that he finds this way, and you'll see it as I read through it again. He finds a way to not look at his own circumstances, but look at the circumstances of what God is doing around him. Notice how he talks. He talks about, all this has happened to me has served to advance the gospel. That is in verse 12. In verse 13, he says, my imprisonment, which is a bad circumstance, is for Christ. He's not thinking about himself. He's thinking about the gospel and Christ. Later on, you can sit there and says this has made some of the brothers become more confident in the Lord. They're much more bold to speak the word. There's this idea that he's seeing that, silencing him has made others able to speak. And then lastly, he says is, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. Basically what he has done, and as you look in this passage, he said, I'm not looking at me. I'm looking at Christ. I'm looking at the gospel. I'm looking at God's word. And when I look at those things, I don't see anything but good stuff happening. One of the most dangerous things in life is to focus on yourself. I talked about, last week we talked about how when you're a part of something bigger than you, it brings this kind of sense of that you are, it brings a sense of joy to you when you realize you're a part of a global movement, a movement that God put in place from the beginning of time. You know what I mean? That you're a part of God's team from day one to day whatever bajillion day we are in today. whatever that is, you're a part of that team. That brings you joy to see that all the things, crossing of the Red Sea, the resurrection, all of those things, that was something that was for you, on your side. The problem, though, is sometimes if you just focus on you, you can not see any of that and only see your particular situation. The opposite can be true. We can think of ourselves and not see ourselves in a greater context. And you'll see this in a second, we can make good things bad by focusing on ourselves. You can sit there and say, you know what? Our team won, but someone else scored the final point. I wish it would have been me. And now I'm going to be a little bit of a, stick in the mud because I wish I would have been the one to win the game. I wish I was the one who was being carried off the field. And anyway, you see this in popular bands. The Beatles, probably one of the greatest bands of all time, eventually got jealous of one another and said, well, I think I'm the best one. And it broke the band up. You see this everywhere. If you want to, you can take success, focus on yourself, and ruin it. Make it bad news instead of good news. That is the danger of framing things solely on what you feel about them. The secret to Paul's joy was that he looked beyond himself and looked at what God was doing. Now, there's a passage in Hebrews that this kind of thought jumps to my mind every time when I'm thinking about it, and it's a long passage, but I'm just going to read a little bit of it. But it's this basically. It's the author of Hebrews is talking about the accomplishments of what people of faith have done. He talks about Abraham and Moses, and at the end he kind of just sums up, and he says, verse 32, chapter 11, verse 32, he says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me if I tell you of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight." You're just thinking like, win, awesome. These guys are doing great things. And it says, women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they may rise again to a better life. Others, mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about the deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all of these, though commended through their faith, and it said, did not receive the promise, meaning they'd yet to see Jesus, the fulfillment of their faith. And so what's interesting to me is that this author, he's saying all of these people are heroes of the faith. Whether they conquered armies, stopped the mouths of lions, or they were sawn in two or thrown in jail. All of them were heroes of the faith. They did something out of faith that continued and promoted God's kingdom. That is what happens when you don't think about yourself versus what God is up to. I want to look again now at the circumstances I talked about that Paul was going through that lens. And I'm going to tell you guys, it's neat. It's neat when you see that when you change the perspective, what a difference it makes in how you look at circumstances. I talked about how Paul was about to be killed by this mob, and so he appeals to Caesar because he's a Roman citizen. And because of that, key officials like Felix Herod Agrippa and Caesar himself actually heard the gospel. You have to understand, Israel at this time in the Roman Empire is a kind of a backwater place, kind of a fringe tribe that they don't necessarily. So the things that happen there probably are not going to interest the higher-ups, the elites. They're going to sit there and say, that's really not something I care about. What the common people are arguing about or talking about is nothing to do with me. Yeah, but because Paul gets imprisoned, he is now talking to these guys, meeting with them, sharing the gospel with them. They otherwise probably would have never taken the time to actually hear or listen to what the controversy was. And because of this, now that Paul's been imprisoned so long, he's met every imperial guard. Every imperial guard has now heard the gospel. It's kind of an interesting way of getting that done. But he says the entire imperial guard has heard, and they see what does it mean to be a Christian, not through what they've heard on the street, but firsthand from one of the most influential leaders. Now, this is important because if you don't understand the context, you'll miss this. At the time, Rome thought that Christians, this group, this sect of Judaism, when they heard rumors of them, there was rumors that Christians were cannibals because they took communion. Now, and they said, this is the body of Christ and this is the blood of Christ. And so there was a rumor going around that they were actually cannibals, not understanding that was a symbolic gesture. There were rumors that they were revolutionaries, that they were going to, dethrone Caesar and get rid of him. So when they're able to talk to someone firsthand about what does it really mean, it kind of gives them the opportunity to clarify it. It makes them from interesting. Some of the earliest articles or letters that we have about the church are from Roman officials to one another trying to figure out what do we do with these people. There was one that was saying that, they take care of our widows and our orphans. They serve our own poor better than we do. And I'm supposed to, and they're the enemy. Now, they did see that. And here I'm going to read you one of these letters. This is from a man named Pliny. That was his name, Pliny the Younger. And it says, the sum of their guilt had amounted only to this, that on an appointed day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn, antiphonally to Christ. So they're kind of a cappella singing to Christ, as to God. And then they bind themselves by an oath, not for the commission of any crime, but to abstain from theft, from robbery, from adultery, and breach of faith, and not to deny a deposit when it was claimed. After the conclusion of this ceremony, it was their custom to depart and meet again to take food, but it was ordinary and harmless food. This is the man who's writing to his authority saying, I know I've been told to execute Christians. I'm trying to kind of, really? They seem to, they do this. They do this, they sing some songs, they devote themselves to doing good in our world, and then they go eat together, and they're not eating each other, they're just eating food. And so, and this is a Roman authority basically saying, okay, all right, and that's exactly what was happening. So you're thinking the people who are in charge, they're having to wrestle with, wait, I thought that these people were supposed to be like awful in our community, and they were a danger to us. And yet when I meet them, they seem pretty nice. They seem pretty harmless. And so I am sure that even though they're following orders, there's some wheels turning on the inside of their heads. So getting to speak to every single one of these guards gives every one of them a first-hand impression of what a Christian is all about. His freedom hadn't been taken away, but rather his freedom actually had been to share the gospel to places that were previously unreachable, at least in Paul's mind. There's an old comic book line where it says, "You think I'm locked in here with you? No, you're locked in here with me." And it's the idea that I think that's how Paul saw it. You think you put me in jail, but no, you've actually set me free and you have to now, you're stuck with me. So that's his way of seeing it. His imprisonment also forced others to step up. And his joy in his imprisonment gave them courage to do so. That's why I think that's why we like stories and testimonies of what people have done in the name of faith. And whenever you hear one of those, it usually encourages you to be a little bolder, a little stronger. When you see someone else doing something that makes you proud, you yourself want to emulate that. And those competing with him who were trying to kind of do him harm in jail were actually doing what he most wanted them to do. They saw it as a rivalry and a competition. He's like, I don't care. Sure. They're wanting to compete. He's like, I just want us all to play. And so he's thrilled that even though people are trying to steal his thunder, take his position of power, or whatever it might be, they're preaching the gospel. And that's all I really care about. Not only that, but the church itself now has to sit there and say, what should we look for in our leaders? If we see leaders who are selfish and ambitious and all that kind of stuff, are they the ones that we should be listening to, or is it the ones who are humble and care not for themselves, but they care for the gospel? And the answer to that question is that we don't know any of those guys' names, but yet we know Paul. Paul was obviously the one that the church sat there and said, no, they're doing it for whatever reason, but you are doing it for the right reason. Now, and I say the biggest one of the things that you would sit there and say of all of this is that this forced Paul to write letters that he couldn't, they used to write letters, let me put it this way, they used to write letters saying, hey, I'm heading over there, expect me in a few weeks. End of letter. And then he'd show up and they would teach and they would invest in people, and that was the extent of it. Paul being in prison, he does not get to visit these churches anymore, so everything he wants to communicate to them, he now has to communicate to them via letter. And guess what? Now we get to benefit from that wisdom, that truth. Those letters are what make up our Bibles. If it wasn't for Paul's imprisonment, we would not have the scriptures that we have today. Same circumstances, all the same things, just looking at it from a slightly different perspective. You see it? I hope you do. Paul chose joy because he saw what God was doing through him, around him, about him, around the world, rather than focused on just what was happening to him. Now, I want to say this lens, this way of changing perspective is universal. It's not something that only Paul could do. We can do that today, and literally around the world today. For everyone who thinks that this world is going downwards, when I look around, I see the church is growing around our world. And through the people we support, often that's where it's happening. We should not be thinking that we're on the downward slide. When I was in college, there was this thing called the 1040 window, and it was kind of these latitudes, and it was basically saying in this block, which was the most populous block of the earth, there were no churches. And the gospel was basically silenced in this block. You don't hear about that 1040 window anymore because many of those countries who used to have 0 Christians now have thousands upon thousands of Christians in them. And the church is growing. I'm talking places like China, like India, like Iran, like Albania. Places that used to be completely closed off. You see those places now growing. So globally, we should not be feeling like we are diminishing. Just recently, I know some of the people in our church, and our church itself supports the Jesus film. You know, that was made in 1979, right? You know, it's dated by all intents and purposes, yet it still is bringing tens of thousands of people to Christ every year as it's being shown around the world. And this blew my mind. 500 million decisions for Christ since it was established and made. 500 million. Holy cow. You know, is the world a bad and ugly place? Sure. But God is still doing some amazing things. And I don't want to end there. That's globally, but even think locally. There are stories of God at work in our very own midst. And here's the caveat: if you choose to see them. If you choose to see them, they are there. The story of Billy Graham coming to faith, I don't know if you ever remember this, is a guy who had kind of a revival meeting, and it was really no one showed up but Billy Graham. And so he thought he was a failure, but he brought Billy Graham to faith, and then Billy Graham would go on to help millions upon millions hear the gospel and come to faith. So was he really a failure? No, not in the scheme of the thing. I remember a mentor pastor of mine once went to a Bible study. He was a college football player. Went to a Bible study, heard the study going on. He sneaks in, and he realizes he's the only one there. No one came, but yet the man was still teaching his Bible study. And he was so struck by this man's commitment that he decided to go into ministry himself. Little things that we think sometimes mean nothing, in the grand scheme of things, actually are the first domino to fall. And I don't think we think that way, but we need to think that way. Whatever God is doing it through you, I think one of the greatest things that we can ever realize, and one of the most constant sources of joy that we could ever find, is that God is using me for His purposes. And for whatever way, whether it be things that aren't going well and how I respond to it versus things that are going great. If God is using you, take joy in that. Know that you're a part of a much bigger plan. And that it is one of the greatest things you can ever acknowledge and know in life is that you are one of God's tools and instruments in this world. And when you see that clearly, I don't think you can do anything but have joy. Joy is available to anybody and everybody who just says, Lord, use me. I choose to let you do whatever you want. And whatever circumstances may come, just use me for your purposes and your glory. And He will. And He will do great things through it. As long as we choose to see it. Let's pray. Lord Father, thank you so much for the privilege it is to be used by you in whatever way you see fit. Lord, sometimes I feel like we get our own desires mixed up and we forget to look for what you are doing and what you're up to in our world. Sometimes we can focus on the negative just because it's so easy to do it. Lord, I pray that we would have eyes to see where you're at work. And Lord, may that bring us joy. Knowing, Lord, that we're a part of a plan that will see itself through and will end in victory. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.